She was 17 years old, a young black girl flying alone for the first time, proud and quiet with her first-class ticket in hand. She followed every rule. She took her seat just like everyone else, but still a flight attendant decided she didn't belong and forced her to move to the back of the plane without a second thought. Amara Johnson didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply pulled out her phone and sent one short message to someone who knew exactly how to make the system listen. Within minutes, the engines were shut down. The flight was grounded, and the person who humiliated her in front of silent passengers, she was the one being escorted off the plane under the same silent stares that once ignored the injustice. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us where in the world you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of quiet strength and real justice, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Amara Johnson moved through Los Angeles International Airport with steady steps, her backpack snug against her shoulder, her boarding pass tucked into the sleeve of her hoodie. 17 years old, black and careful not to draw any extra attention. She followed the signs leading her toward Gate 23. The TSA agent glanced at her ID, then up at her, pausing for a beat longer than he had for the passenger before her. His mouth twitched slightly before he handed her documents back without a word. Amara gave a polite nod and moved on without slowing down. The gate area buzzed with the familiar low noise of travelers waiting for boarding calls. Businessmen in pressed suits, families juggling carry-ons, and restless toddlers, couples murmuring quietly over coffee. Amara found an empty spot by the windows, her headphones resting around her neck, her hoodie pulled a little higher on her shoulders. She stayed small, patient, letting the rhythm of the airport move around her. When the first-class boarding announcement came, she stepped forward. A few heads turned. A man in a tailored navy blazer glanced over his eyes, moving quickly from her sneakers to her face. A woman with pearl earrings adjusted her purse and whispered something to the person beside her. No one said anything to Amara directly. They never did, but she felt the ripple anyway, like a breeze. You can't see but know is there. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Miss Johnson." Amara smiled back, small and polite, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin glowed under soft lighting. Wide seats, white linen, headrest covers, the faint scent of leather and fresh carpet. She located her seat 3B and slid into it without hesitation. She tucked her backpack neatly under the seat in front of her, kept her hoodie sleeves pulled low over her wrists, and folded her hands in her lap. Outside the window, sunlight flashed against the wings of other planes lined up along the tarmac. A few more passengers filtered in. Across the aisle, a man in gray trousers adjusted his laptop and shot her a brief glance. 2 rows ahead, a woman turned slightly, her eyes flickering toward Amara before quickly looking away. Amara kept her gaze steady out the window, unmoved. She had earned this seat, months of late nights, early mornings, projects, and presentations. She'd topped her class in a national STEM program, and Victoria Reed, her godmother, her mentor, had insisted she travel to celebrate properly. "You belong here as much as anyone," Victoria had said. "Don't forget that." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard SkyWest Flight 1087 to Chicago. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. Amara fastened her belt, switched her phone into airplane mode, and leaned back carefully. The leather seat was cool under her arms. The cabin around her filled with the soft rustling of settling passengers and the muted hum of engines preparing for departure. She adjusted the headphones around her neck, though she didn't put them on just yet. For now, seat 3B was hers, and that was enough. Linda Carter moved down the aisle with the confident grace of someone who had worked flights like this for over 15 years. She adjusted a blanket here, offered a quick nod there, keeping an eye on the passengers settling into their seats. First class usually ran like clockwork. Familiar types, business executives, frequent flyers, the occasional celebrity hidden behind dark sunglasses. She was halfway through her final check when she saw Amara, a teenage girl sitting quietly in 3B hoodie, pulled low backpack tucked under the seat, headphones resting around her neck. Black, young, alone. Linda's steps slowed just a fraction. Her eyes flickered over the boarding pass tucked into Amara's sleeve, though she couldn't actually read it from where she stood. Still, something about it snagged at her instincts. First class wasn't cheap. First class wasn't casual. She'd seen enough to know that. She smiled tightly and kept moving, but the seed was planted. As the boarding line continued to shuffle in, Linda stationed herself near the galley, folding napkins and pretending not to watch. But she saw it, the subtle glances from other passengers. A man adjusting his cufflinks stole a look, A woman flipping through a magazine paused just long enough to glance over the top. No words, but the message floated between them like static. Something doesn't add up. Linda smoothed the napkins again, even though they were already straight. She told herself not to overthink it. Maybe the girl was traveling with family seated elsewhere. Maybe it was a mistake at the ticket counter. Maybe it wasn't her business, but old habits pressed in. She had been commended once years ago for spotting a man with a counterfeit boarding pass. She had trusted her gut then, and it had been right. You didn't ignore things that felt off, not when you were responsible for the safety and order of the cabin. Her gaze shifted back to Amara. The girl sat still, hands folded, looking out the window. Not nervous, not lost. Calm. Too calm, Linda thought. Passengers who didn't belong usually fidgeted, looked around too much, called attention to themselves. This one didn't. That somehow unsettled her even more. Across the aisle, a businessman in a gray suit caught Linda's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head as if to say, "Are you seeing this?" Linda pressed her lips together and busied herself adjusting a service cart that didn't need adjusting, the polished cabin around her. The gleaming leather seats, the fresh flowers tucked into their silver vases, the steady hum of quiet conversation suddenly felt tighter, less ordered. She thought of the manifest tucked into the front pocket of her uniform. She thought about the checklist she was supposed to trust. Still the unease coiled tighter. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was imagining things, but Linda Carter had learned one thing in all her years in the sky. You don't ignore a feeling. The cabin had mostly settled. Overhead bins clicked shut. Passengers flipped through magazines or scrolled phones. The hum of final preparations filled the air. Linda Carter checked the last row of first class, smoothing the nearest headrest cover. Then she turned. Her shoes clicked softly against the aisle carpet as she moved toward seat 3B. Amara sensed her before she saw her. The flight attendant stopped beside her, standing a little too close. "Excuse me," Linda said, voice pitched higher than necessary. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Heads lifted. Nearby conversations stalled. Amara blinked and reached calmly into the sleeve of her hoodie, pulling out the neatly folded ticket. She offered it without hesitation. Linda took it, her lips pressed tight. Her eyes scanned it once, then again, as if expecting it to dissolve in her hands. Her forehead creased. "First class?" Amara said quietly, just to clarify, just to be sure. Linda's jaw tightened. She handed the pass back without a word. Then louder, "I'm sorry, but there must be a mistake. You'll need to move to economy." The words dropped heavy into the stillness. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer shifted uncomfortably. A few seats back, a child's voice cut through. "Why is she moving?" A mother hissed softly. "Shh," pulling the child closer. Amara sat frozen for a second. Not from fear, from the sharpness of it. The way it landed not as a question, but a command. She looked down at her ticket again as if maybe she had read it wrong. She hadn't. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, her voice even. Linda's smile tightened into something brittle. "I understand, but there's been a seating error. Please gather your things." A few passengers exchanged glances but kept their eyes lowered, pretending interest in safety cards and seatbelt buckles. No one said a word. Amara swallowed once, the hurt pressing hard against her ribs. She tucked the ticket back into her sleeve, leaned forward and retrieved her backpack from under the seat. Her movements were smooth, almost mechanical. Her face betrayed nothing. Linda stepped aside, giving her space to move. As Amara rose, she caught the gaze of the woman in pearls 2 rows ahead. The woman blinked and looked away. Amara slung her backpack over one shoulder and walked slowly down the aisle toward the economy cabin. She didn't rush. She didn't hang her head. She kept her steps measured, her breathing steady, though her chest burned. Behind her, the low murmur of first class resumed, softer, now tinged with something brittle and ugly. Linda turned back toward the galley, her face calm, her hands smoothing the skirt of her uniform like nothing had happened. Seat 3B sat empty under the soft lights, and Amara, with her valid ticket in her steady hands, was gone from sight. Amara found a seat near the back of the economy cabin, pressed against the window, her backpack tucked neatly at her feet. She slid into the cramped seat without a sound, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The overhead lights buzzed softly. Passengers squeezed past each other, finding overhead space, adjusting seats, oblivious to the small storm that had just unfolded a few rows ahead. Her chest felt tight, but she kept her breathing steady. She leaned her forehead lightly against the cool window for a second, letting the cold bite into her skin. Then she pulled her phone from her hoodie pocket and unlocked it with a slow swipe. No hesitation, no second guessing. She opened her messages and found the most familiar thread. She typed quickly. She made me leave my seat. Said I didn't belong. Her thumb hovered for a split second, then hit send. The message flew off into the ether, leaving a hollow in her chest. Outside, the tarmac buzzed with motion. The plane's engines whirred to life, a low growl trembling through the floorboards. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, closing overhead bins with clipped motions. The aircraft began to push back from the gate, lurching gently as the ground crew waved it onto the taxiway. The cabin dipped into a practiced silence, the ritual beginning, the takeoff countdown underway. Amara's phone vibrated once in her hand. Victoria Reed. Stay where you are. I'll handle it. 4 short sentences. Steady, commanding. No panic. No questions. Just action. Amara tightened her grip on the phone and tucked it into the front pocket of her hoodie. The plane rolled slowly toward the runway, engines humming louder now. Flight attendants hurried through final checks, nodding at passengers securing carts, locking lavatories. Amara sat still, her face calm, but her pulse beat fast against her wrist. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, forcing herself to breathe, to be small, to be unnoticed. She wasn't sure what her godmother would do. She only knew Victoria never said she'd handle something unless she meant it. Miles away, in a quiet office lined with aviation charts and regulation books, Victoria Reed set down her coffee, pulled her headset on, and tapped a line that bypassed normal airline protocols entirely. The screen flashed FAA ground control, direct line. Her voice was steady when the line clicked open. This is Director Victoria Reed. I need to file an immediate compliance concern regarding SkyWest Flight 1087 currently on taxi at LAX. She gave the flight number, the aircraft code, the captain's name. Each word crisp, professional, undeniable. On the other end, the ground operations coordinator's tone changed instantly. Yes, Director. We'll hold them at the next checkpoint. Victoria leaned back in her chair, watching the airport's grid map light up in real time on her second monitor. The wheels were already turning, and the plane wasn't going anywhere, not yet. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bennett adjusted his headset and scanned the taxi instructions flashing across his screen. SkyWest, Flight 1087 was 5th in line for takeoff routine day. Clear skies. Nothing unusual. Until the private line buzzed. The CO pilot looked up sharply. Bennett pressed the button. This is ground control. Immediate hold order on Flight 1087 FAA request. Repeat, do not proceed to runway. Return to gate. Bennett frowned. Confirm the reason. Static. Then, compliance investigation, further instructions pending. The line went dead. Bennett exchanged a look with his co-pilot, a silent understanding passing between them. Orders from FAA didn't come lightly. You didn't question them. You complied. He picked up the intercom and flipped the switch. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to hold briefly due to a minor delay. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll update you shortly. He kept his tone light, casual, the way pilots do when they don't want to start a panic. In the first-class cabin, Linda Carter smoothed the folds of her uniform and moved briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts. She noticed the engines idling lower than usual. The plane wasn't rolling anymore. The crew had stopped preparing for takeoff. Something felt off, but she brushed it aside. Delays happened. Air traffic control changed things all the time. Nothing to worry about. Linda busied herself with small tasks, refolding a blanket, here adjusting a tray, there, anything to keep her hands occupied. She kept her posture tall, her expression neutral. Whatever the delay was, it wasn't her concern, or so she told herself. Across the aisle, Daniel Miller watched her closely. Daniel had seen the exchange earlier, the way Linda had approached the black teenager in 3B, the way she had spoken loud enough for others to hear, the way she hadn't questioned anyone else, just her. At the time, he hadn't said anything. Senior attendants like Linda set the tone. You didn't challenge them unless you had to. But now, as the plane sat motionless at the edge of the tarmac, Daniel's unease grew. He adjusted the service cart mechanically, pretending to check the supplies. His mind raced through the sequence of events. Passenger and first-class tickets shown, still moved. No escalation, no resistance, just moved. He glanced down the aisle toward economy. He couldn't see Amara from where he stood, but he could feel the hole she had left behind. Linda passed him without a word, her smile tight, her steps clipped. Daniel didn't say anything either, not yet. But deep down he knew. The delay wasn't because of weather, it wasn't because of traffic, it wasn't mechanical. Something bigger was moving, something neither he nor Linda could see yet, and it had already reached them before the wheels ever left the ground. The plane sat idle on the taxiway, the engines humming at a low, restless pitch. At first, most passengers didn't notice. Delays happened. Mechanical checks, paperwork, holdups, crew, timing out. But as the minutes dragged on, unease began to ripple through the cabin. Whispers moved like currents between rows. Why weren't they moving? Why? No announcements. People exchanged looks across aisles, lowered their voices, leaned in closer. In economy, Amara sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her phone resting face down on the tray table. She hadn't moved since the plane stopped. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, her face unreadable. Every muscle in her body was locked steady, like she was holding a position in a storm and waiting for it to pass. But this time she wasn't the one who needed to move. She could feel the shift happening, slow at first, then faster. Tension thickened the air, a low hum of worry and speculation filling the narrow cabin. A few rows up, a man stood to open the overhead bin and was quickly told to sit back down. Another woman pressed the call button and was met with a flight attendant's polite but clipped reassurance. "We'll be underway shortly, ma'am. Thank you for your patience." In first class, Linda Carter moved stiffly through the cabin, pretending to reorganize a service cart that didn't need reorganizing. Her hands moved too quickly, knocking a bottle of water over. She caught it before it hit the floor, but several passengers nearby turned to look. She smiled, tight and brittle, and kept moving. The whispers grew louder. Flight attendants spoke in low tones near the galley, exchanging glances they thought passengers wouldn't notice. Daniel Miller stood by the curtain that separated first class from economy, his arms crossed over his chest, watching everything quietly. He saw the way Linda's shoulders tensed, the way she avoided looking at passengers directly now, the way her hands shook slightly when she handed a passenger a glass of water. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. The storm was gathering without a single raised voice. At the rear of the plane, a man in a worn leather jacket muttered, "Bet it's some mechanical thing." His seatmate shook her head. "No announcement. Not even a delay notice. That's not normal." Further up, a teenage boy whispered to his sister, "You think someone's in trouble?" Amara heard it all. She didn't turn her head. She didn't flinch. She simply sat there, the calm center in a swirling room of uncertainty. The intercom crackled once, then went silent. No updates. No explanations. In the cockpit, Captain Bennett watched the messages stack up on his monitor. FAA compliance team, en route, hold position, secure cabin, no takeoff authorization. He knew better than to question it. Orders from FAA weren't suggestions. He stood slowly unbuckling his harness and moved to confer with the lead flight attendant. His face was set professional, but his mind was already calculating what the fallout could mean. Back in first class, Linda tucked a tray into its slot with more force than necessary. She turned toward the galley, trying to catch her breath. Sweat beaded lightly at her temples. She wasn't sure when the shift happened, when the confident rhythm of the flight had turned into something colder, watchful, but now she could feel it everywhere, in the silence of the passengers, in the hushed voices of the crew, in the way Daniel Miller kept his eyes on her just a second too long. Somewhere back there she knew was the girl she had pulled from seat 3B. And whatever was happening now, whatever was coming, had started with her. The summons came with a quiet knock at Linda's shoulder. Captain Bennett stood there, expression tight, voice low enough for nearby passengers not to hear. "Cockpit. Now." Linda nodded stiffly and followed him down the narrow aisle, her palms damp against her uniform skirt. She avoided meeting anyone's eyes as she passed, focusing on the neat rows of seats, the polished silver trim along the walls. Anything but the faces. Inside the cockpit, the door clicked shut behind her. Captain Bennett pointed to the jump seat. She sat without being asked. A second voice crackled through the comms headset resting on the dashboard. "Flight 187, confirm crew member Linda Carter is present." Bennett picked up the mic. "Confirmed." The voice was calm, professional, but there was no mistaking the authority underneath. "This is FAA compliance operations. We have been notified of an onboard seating violation involving a minor passenger with a valid ticket. Immediate corrective action is required." Linda opened her mouth to explain, but Bennett raised a hand. "Listen," he said quietly. The voice continued. "Flight crew member Linda Carter is to locate the displaced passenger, return her to her original seat, and issue a public apology. This action is mandatory before departure. Clearance will be considered." Silence filled the cockpit. Linda stared at the panel in front of her, words knotting up in her throat. "This is not a discussion," the voice added. Compliance reports are being filed. Your actions are under official review." The line went dead. Captain Bennett looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what you have to do." Linda nodded once, sharp and mechanical. She stood and exited the cockpit, her legs heavy under her. The cabin felt different now, heavier. The passengers had felt the shift too. Their gazes tracked her openly this time. No more quick glances, no more pretending not to notice. Daniel Miller stood at the edge of the galley watching her with a frown etched deep into his face. Linda moved down the aisle toward economy, her steps steady only because she forced them to be. She found Amara easily. The girl hadn't moved. She sat composed, her phone resting face down on the tray table, her backpack neatly at her feet. Linda stopped beside her. Amara turned her head slowly, meeting her gaze without flinching. Linda cleared her throat. "Miss Johnson," she said, the words tasting heavy, foreign. There was an error. "We'd like to return you to your assigned seat in first class. I apologize for the confusion." Amara didn't move. She tilted her head slightly. "Confusion," she said softly. Linda swallowed. She felt the eyes on her passengers craning to hear, to witness. "I misjudged the situation." Linda said, her voice quieter. "I'm sorry." Amara studied her for a beat longer. Then she rose smoothly, gathering her backpack without a word. But as she stepped into the aisle, she paused. "I'd like you to say it," Amara said, her tone even. "Say what you did." Linda's face flushed hot under the cabin lights. "I removed you from your seat without cause," she said, "and I was wrong." Passengers nearby shifted their postures, tightening their faces, unreadable but attentive. Amara nodded once, calm and measured, and followed Linda back down the aisle toward first class. As they walked, heads turned openly. Eyes that had once looked through her now locked onto her. No one pretended not to see anymore. At seat 3B, Linda stood aside. Amara slipped into her rightful place without fanfare, buckled her seatbelt, and leaned back against the cool leather. Linda hesitated a moment longer, her hands stiff at her sides. Then, with no other excuse to offer, she turned and disappeared toward the galley. Amara sat still, facing forward, feeling the weight of the cabin shift again. Not out of pity, out of recognition. The cabin doors opened again, not with the usual bustle of boarding agents or catering crews, but with a quiet authority that shifted the entire mood of the plane. Two individuals stepped aboard. One wore the Navy uniform of an FAA compliance officer, the other a man in a dark suit with a visible badge clipped to his belt. Neither smiled, neither spoke. They moved with a certainty that left no room for questions. Passengers stiffened in their seats, heads turning subtly, conversations dying mid-sentence. Some pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages, but angling cameras toward the aisle. The lead officer spoke briefly with Captain Bennett at the front. Then he nodded once, scanning the cabin until his eyes landed on Linda Carter standing near the galley. "Flight Attendant Carter," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without shouting. "You'll need to come with us." Linda froze for half a second. Her hands fumbled at the hem of her uniform before she composed herself. "Of course," she said, though her voice lacked any real strength. She stepped forward, her movements mechanical. The two officers flanked her without touching her, their presence enough to make the message clear. The aisle stretched before her like a long, narrow hallway under a spotlight. As she walked, the passengers watched, some with surprise, some with satisfaction. Most with a heavy, unsettled silence. Phones recorded discreetly. Screens blinked red in the corners of lowered hands. No one said anything. No one needed to. Halfway up the aisle, Linda's gaze flickered toward Amara, still seated calmly in 3B. Amara didn't move. She didn't gloat. She didn't even raise her eyes fully. She simply sat, her posture easy but unshakable, her presence commanding without a single word. Linda looked away quickly. Each step toward the exit felt heavier than the last. The polished leather of first class, the quiet rustle of passengers shifting in their seats, the oppressive weight of understanding that the rules she once enforced so confidently had turned against her. At the cabin door, Linda paused briefly, almost as if expecting someone to stop her. No one did. The officers ushered her into the jet bridge and out of sight. When the door sealed behind them with a soft hiss, the cabin exhaled as one. No announcements were made, no explanations offered. But everyone understood. Judgment had come not with noise but with precision. Linda's silent walk out of the aircraft left a mark deeper than any reprimand could. And Amara, 17 years old, alone but not powerless, had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She remained seated in 3B, her hands resting quietly on her thighs, her face calm. Around her, the plane vibrated with a new kind of silence. Not the silence of dismissal, the silence of recognition. It didn't take long. By the time Flight 1087 finally returned to the gate and passengers began disembarking, the first whispers of the incident had already made their way onto social media. A short video, no more than 30 seconds, showed Linda Carter walking stiffly down the aisle, flanked by FAA officers. No sound, just images enough. Within an hour, the video had spread. Within 2, it had gone viral. Hashtags multiplied. Sky West scandal. Flying while black. Seat injustice comments flooded in outrage, disbelief, calls for boycotts. The story caught fire. National news outlets picked it up by mid-afternoon. Local stations ran footage from the tarmac panel shows, debated it in primetime slots. The name Amara Johnson began to appear everywhere, though Victoria moved quickly to protect her goddaughter's privacy. Victoria Reed was no stranger to the gears of public scrutiny. She made a few calls, then a few more. Within 24 hours, statements from major civil rights organizations hit the wires. The National Equity Alliance, the Center for Aviation Fairness, independent watchdog groups, all condemning the incident, all demanding answers. Victoria gave one carefully measured interview to a respected network, her voice, even her words, deliberate. "This is not just about one flight," she said. "This is about a system that needs to see every passenger as deserving of dignity, not based on how they look, but based on who they are, a paying traveler, nothing more, nothing less." The backlash against SkyWest Airlines grew louder by the hour. Faced with mounting pressure, the airline's leadership scrambled. By day 2, SkyWest released a formal public apology. "We deeply regret the events that occurred on Flight 1087. Discrimination of any kind is unacceptable and against our company's values. We are undertaking an immediate internal review and will be implementing new training and policy changes to ensure incidents like this never happen again." The statement was met with skepticism. Words were cheap, actions were needed. FAA officials weren't waiting. Behind closed doors, draft proposals began circulating. Mandatory anti-bias training for all flight attendants. Revised protocols for seat verification. Mandatory escalation procedures requiring supervisor confirmation before removing any seated passenger. Independent oversight panels to audit airline compliance reports. Victoria reviewed early drafts herself, offering pointed edits, adding real teeth to what might have been empty promises. It wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to say we're learning. There needed to be change, structural, permanent, visible, and this time they couldn't sweep it under the rug. Inside SkyWest's corporate offices, emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Executives pored over footage, analyzed passenger statements, reviewed internal crew reports. Linda Carter's name was quietly removed from the roster. An internal memo confirmed her employment had been terminated for conduct violations, but the damage had been done, not just to SkyWest's image, but to the false sense of security that had let things fester for so long. The world had watched a 17-year-old girl be questioned, displaced, and dismissed, and then, without raising her voice, watched her stand firm enough to move an entire system. The headlines came first. SkyWest Airlines announces sweeping reforms after Flight 1087. Incident mandatory bias. Training to roll out across all departments. New oversight panel to ensure passenger rights enforcement. Amara read them quietly from her living room couch, one leg tucked underneath her, a blanket thrown carelessly across her lap. The late afternoon sun spilled through the windows, painting the room in muted gold. The television played a muted news segment in the background. A neatly dressed anchor summarized the airline's response leadership changes. Mandatory retraining, a public partnership with national civil rights organizations. Words scrolled across the bottom of the screen. New policies, new procedures, a new era, they promised. Amara didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She simply watched, absorbing it all. Her phone buzzed once on the armrest. A message from Victoria. "Check your mail when you get a second." Curious, Amara padded down the hall to the front door where a slim white envelope waited on the floor. No markings except her name in clean official print. Inside, a letter from SkyWest's board of directors, formal, heavy, with careful words. They expressed their gratitude to her for her patience, her dignity, her restraint. They acknowledged that her experience had sparked overdue conversations. They thanked her for helping them see where they had failed to look before. No excuses, no justifications, just acknowledgement. Victoria's handwritten note was tucked inside as well, scribbled on the margin of the envelope flap. You didn't have to yell, you just had to stand. I'm proud of you, V. Amara ran her fingers lightly over the words before setting the letter down on the table. She drifted toward the balcony, sliding the glass door open with a soft scrape. Outside, the Los Angeles skyline stretched wide and endless, bathed in the orange hues of sunset. The city buzzed in the distance, cars crawling through intersections, planes tracing lines across the sky. She leaned on the railing, feeling the rough texture of the metal under her palms. It still felt surreal how something so small, a seat, a glance, a single decision could ripple outward strong enough to shake walls built higher than she could see. She hadn't raised her voice that day. She hadn't made a scene. She had simply stayed in her seat, stayed in her truth, stayed visible. The world had moved because she refused to. She let her eyes close for a moment, letting the warmth of the evening settle into her skin. Not every fight needed noise, not every victory needed celebration. Some victories looked like sitting still when everything else tried to push you aside. She opened her eyes again, watching the lights of the city flicker to life one by one. And as the first stars blinked into the deepening sky, a thought came to her. Clear, solid, unshakable. True power doesn't scream. It simply moves, and everyone else follows. If this story moved, you please like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Your voice matters, and every time we share these truths, we help them echo farther. This story shows that when injustice is left unchecked, it leads to real consequences. But when someone stands firm with quiet dignity, true strength shines through. It reminds us that systemic bias still exists, sometimes silent, sometimes hidden, but always real. Such incidents still happen every day in workplaces, on airlines, and across the corners of everyday life where assumptions go unchallenged. In our personal lives, we should look beyond appearances and choose empathy over judgment. In the workplace, we must hold ourselves and others accountable, making sure respect is more than just a word in a policy manual. As a community, we must stand beside those who are silenced, even when it's easier to stay quiet, because by practicing values like respect and humility, we build a more inclusive and just society, one where no one ever has to fight for the seat they've already earned.